Russia is pushing. Is there any chance Ukraine can stop enemy forces in place? Zelensky mobilized Western allies to send F-16 as soon as possible. But is it really possible? When could we see new jet fighters over Ukrainian sky? Putin threatens the whole West for military support. Is it World War III? Scary fairy tales by Kremlin. We will ruin them alongside our partners StopFake Ruslan. This is Spotlight Ukraine. More of this right now. Russian troops have intensified their offensive in all areas of the front line. They are attacking from 5 directions at once, trying to take the initiative before Ukraine receives new weapons from its partners. So the next few weeks will be decisive in Russia's war against Ukraine, said Charles Michel, the president of the European Council. And the Ukrainian leadership says that the occupiers will launch the biggest offensive in this war for the anniversary of the Russian invasion on February the 24th.
This is the sound of Bakhmut for the past few months. More than 6,000 civilians are still living in this hell without water, electricity or gas. Almost 200 children are among them.
You have to be safe, do you understand? Because little children, right there. Tell me, is there shooting? Is there a bank?
What kind of war is this? People lose their loved ones, people lose their homes. Houses are one thing, but guys, our young guys are dying. We may or may not rebuild our houses, but we are losing our youth.
The occupiers have thrown all their forces to surround Bakhmut, says the Ukrainian Defense Ministry. The Russians have probably gained fire control over 2 main roads to the city, to Slavyansk and Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka, and earlier Wagnerites have likely seized the road connecting Bakhmut to Siversk, the UK Ministry of Defense reports.
We continue to use roads despite the risk of shelling, but in addition to these roads, there is another road from Bakhmut to Chasiv Yar. Beyond Bakhmut, there is another line of defense starting from Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka and beyond. This line of defense is on a hill, and I think that the enemy's advance several kilometers deeper into our territory will actually be associated with even more losses as compared to what they suffered trying to capture Bakhmut and when capturing Soledar. The enemy is now actively attacking in 5 directions: Kupiansk, Svatove, Kreminna, Bakhmut, Vuhledar, and the action around Donetsk. And in all these directions, the enemy is now trying to probe and find weakness in our defense.
Ukraine's defense minister Oleksiy Reznikov believes that Russia will launch a decisive offensive by February the 24th, the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine.
Despite everything, we expect a possible Russian offensive in February. This is only from the point of view of symbolism. It's not logical from a military view, because not all of their resources are ready, but they are doing it anyway.
The American Institute for the Study of War agrees with this assessment.
Russian military command may be rushing to launch a large-scale offensive operation to conquer Donetsk Oblast in unrealistic time frame and likely without sufficient combat power.
The escalation of the situation at the front coincided with increased attention to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The ministry was shaken by a scandal involving inflated purchase prices for food for the military. Deputy Minister Vyacheslav Shapovalov and Director of the Procurement Department Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who were responsible for this area, lost their positions and were suspected of illegal actions. The head of the Department of Military and Technical Policy, Alexander Liev, was also dismissed. The chair of the Minister of Defense was also shaken, but Reznikov is the main negotiator in Ramstein, and it was decided not to replace him for now. In February, the 9th meeting of the contact group will take place, at which Ukraine expects to receive the aircrafts needed for a counteroffensive.
I believe it would be more correct if the President's office also voiced its clear position on this situation. The issue is not only to punish the guilty, but also to eradicate shadow economy, the war, and procurement are now shrouded in. That is, to revise the procurement mechanism. Once again, I know that certain proposals are being made today, including the creation of an anti-corruption council at the Ministry of Defense, made up by public figures. But this should be a broader dialogue with the political leadership of the state, and not just with the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine.
Recently, the US Treasury Department announced that it has no evidence that US money in Ukraine is being misused. There is no reason to talk about a reduction in support from other partners. Denmark, Germany and the Netherlands have issued a joint statement that they will provide Ukraine with 100 Leopard 1 tanks in the coming months. And the Swedish parliament has supported the allocation of a $400 million military aid package.
The Associate Professor of International Relations at the United States Military Academy and Director of West Point's Curriculum in the International Affairs, Dr. Robert Persson is the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. So hello and welcome.
Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening. So hello and welcome. And my first question is, so Russia is likely to launch a new offensive before the Western tanks arrive. So what could happen in this case? Will Russian forces have a chance to achieve any, strategic goals?
I think the chances of Russia achieving strategic success with the upcoming offensive that appears to be in motion are very low. We now understand the Russian way of war as it's being fought in Ukraine. Mr. Putin and his military have very little regard for human life. And so I think that what they will be pouring into the fight are, waves and waves of personnel, recruits, conscripts that are poorly trained, poorly equipped, and sort of the remnants of Wagner forces, other mercenary forces. And so that's not a very effective fighting force. And it's certainly not one that I think is going to be able to make extensive territorial gains or achieve Russia's strategic objectives. But of course, that offensive operation will be very costly, both for Russia and for Ukraine, ultimately, if they're not successful in gaining significant additional territory.
The Western tanks are coming to Ukraine in the upcoming months, but will the amount be enough for the successful counteroffensive?
I think, every bit of combat support, every bit of additional weaponry certainly will help. But of course, the question of will it be enough, to some degree depends on how you define enough. They certainly, when they arrive, will help Ukraine better defend against Russian offensives. And when that Russian offensive finally does culminate and the opportunity to launch a counteroffensive is there, those tanks will be critical in helping lead that charge. At the same time, we should be realistic that the numbers of tanks that have currently been discussed publicly as being provided by the United States, other European allies, probably aren't large enough, aren't great enough, again, to facilitate a massive, significant Ukrainian counteroffensive. And so this is a case where they will help, but certainly more is always better.
Yes, and talking about the tanks, the Leopards, the Challengers, and the Abrams from the United States, can we compare them? Are those tanks will be provided to Ukraine are better than what the Russians have right now?
They certainly are better in terms of their fighting capabilities, their technical characteristics. They are a superior fighting machine. They're superior in terms of the armor that they have, and thus are more likely to survive and be effective in combat. They're also more accurate in their fires, and critically, they are also faster. The rate of fire that can be achieved with the Abrams and the Leopard tanks is faster than that which can be achieved by the Russian tanks. So they're a better fighting machine, and again, will provide a critical difference in what we hope is the upcoming Ukrainian counter-offensive. But in the meantime, again, sort of withstanding the Russian offensive, this very sort of soldier and infantry heavy onslaught is going to be a challenge, I think, in the upcoming months until those tanks arrive.
And when we talk about the tanks, we should consider the fact that there should be an absolutely new infrastructure and the logistics made just from null. So can it be the problem?
So this is a very good point, and this is one of the concerns I know that that the Biden administration and some of our allies had when it came to the question of providing these advanced tanks, particularly the M1 Abrams tank, which again is the most advanced piece of machinery, or the most advanced tank really in the world. It requires a good deal of logistical support. It requires a good deal of maintenance, repair, and of course, training the crews to operate them. And so those are all things that have to be overcome and that take time to overcome. And so when we talk about the delay between when these tanks have been promised and when we actually expect to see them in service, it's not just a matter of finding them, packing them up, and shipping them to Ukraine. It's also ensuring that that those support infrastructure are also there.
Yeah, repairing and some spare parts. Yes. And now let's talk a bit about the F-16, the fighter jets. So how do you think, will the United States send Ukraine those fighter jets? And don't you think that Mr. Biden is now a bit wasting time not sending those fighter jets?
So here, it's an excellent question. Here, I should probably mention that today I'm sharing my own personal views, and these are not the official policy or position of the United States government. But I can say that throughout this conflict, certainly what the Biden administration has been concerned about is the risk of escalation with Russia and the risk of direct combat and conflict between the United States and Russia. The fact that they, like the United States, are fundamentally a nuclear armed country has inserted a degree of caution into the decision making. And so this is one of the reasons why President Biden has been a little bit slower and more deliberate. I think it's been founded on a belief that were we to have provided a large mass of weaponry and support up front, this could have provoked a stronger Russian counter-reaction. But by doing it little by little, sort of incrementally raising the bar, we've been able to avoid that type of retaliation. And so I think that's fundamentally the logic that is holding back a decision to send F-16s to Ukraine. Whether or not those objections will fall eventually, we can only speculate. But again, I think in that respect, it's worth looking back and noting that, just as once upon a time there was reluctance to even send Javelin anti-tank weapons to Ukraine, and the same with the HIMARS systems, and tanks and ever-increasing sophisticated weaponry. With enough time, it certainly is possible that the objections to providing fighter jets also will fall by the wayside. But when and if that will happen, really is only a guess.
Yeah, but talking about the escalation, just a couple of weeks ago, President Putin has said if West can provide Ukraine with new tanks, there's gonna be an escalation from the Russian side, but nothing has happened.
hmm And of course, Mr. Putin has a long history of making aggressive, coercive threats against Ukraine, against the West, against NATO, and we can't dismiss those threats entirely. But we also can't be subject to his blackmail, I think, and I think we have to recognize that his pattern has shown that he tends to speak more of retaliation than action. And when he does retaliate, quite frankly, he retaliates against the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian armed forces. And of course, this war has been a terrible tragedy. But he has not retaliated directly, and certainly not in military terms, against NATO or the United States, because I think he understands that that's fundamentally a battle that he will lose.
But if he can push the nuclear button and do something just to retaliate, so what happens next?
Well, I don't think that he can push the nuclear button to retaliate. He can threaten it, but should he push it, I think even he knows that that will be the end of his rule and the end of his regime in Russia. And so I think, again, my personal view is that the Ukrainian leadership, President Zelensky and his military advisors, have their eyes wide open, and if they believe that acquiring these weapons is necessary for Ukraine's survival, even if it means Russian retaliation against their own people, their own cities, then that's a cost that they're willing to bear, and that's a choice that they should be able to make.
Thank you. And my last question. So what is your personal anticipation? Will this war, Russia's war against Ukraine, will end till the end of this year?
Truth be told, and this is sort of an unfortunate conclusion, in some respects, I don't think that this war will ever end, certainly not as long as Mr. Putin is in power, because even if Ukraine's armed forces are successful in fully ejecting Russian forces from Ukraine's sovereign territory, Mr. Putin will continue his war against Ukraine in the political sphere, cyber sphere, informational sphere. And so in the meantime, yes, it will be a long and protracted, drawn-out military fight. But one that, God willing, the Ukrainian forces will prevail because fundamentally it is their sovereign right to be at peace in their own country.
And will the West continue to support Ukraine till the Putin's death, or as long as it takes?
Yes, as long as it takes. I certainly think so. I believe so because what the leaders in Washington and Brussels and Berlin understand is that this isn't simply Ukraine's fight against Russia. This is something much bigger than Ukraine. And really what Ukraine is fighting for when they face the Russian invaders is the principle of sovereignty and of freedom, and a world in which Russia and other countries are allowed to simply rewrite the rules and rewrite the borders with force is too terrible of an outcome for us to imagine. And so it's very much in our national interest and our collective international interest to ensure that this doesn't stand, this aggression. And so based on that, I certainly do believe that Ukraine's fight is our fight, and that we can and will and should be willing to support it until the end.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this a bit shocking interview with those shocking messages. But still, let's be optimistic. So Dr. Robert Person was the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. Thank you so much once again. Russia's propaganda machine is producing fakes every single day. So we've tried to collect all of them and make a real fake check alongside our partners from StopFake.org.ua. So the scary Russian fakes in our latest review.
Russian foreign minister surprised by ban on Russian language in Ukraine in private life. Russian media distributed another fake about the alleged oppression of Russian speakers in Ukraine, citing Russian foreign minister Sergei Lavrov.
They have some kind of ombudsman for the state language. I don't remember his last name. He came up with an initiative just yesterday and the day before yesterday to ban interpersonal communication in Russian. That is, there is a husband and wife drinking tea together in the kitchen, and some stool pigeon may demand a criminal case to be opened against them. Good prospects for the top of this regime.
There is no harassment of Russian speakers in Ukraine, and moreover, there is no criminal prosecution of Ukrainians who communicate in Russian in everyday life. The law on ensuring the functioning of the Ukrainian language as the state language, adopted by the Ukrainian parliament in April 2019, does not prohibit using any convenient language in personal communication.
This law regulates the functioning and sustenance of the Ukrainian language as a sovereign state in the spheres of social life designated by this law on the entire territory of Ukraine. The law does not extend to the sphere of private communication and the creation of religious rights.
President Zelensky calls for the preemptive nuclear strike on Russia. Discussions about this have intensified online. Posts on this topic are massively distributed in the French segment of Facebook, Twitter, Telegram, and YouTube. Users quote an episode from Zelensky's online speech of the Australian Law Institute in October.
What NATO should do is prevent Russia from using nuclear weapons. But what is important, I appeal to the international community once again, as it was before February 24. Preemptive strikes, so they know what will happen to them, not the other way around. Waiting for Russia's nuclear strikes to then say, oh yes, now we will fight back.
In fact, President Zelensky did not call for a nuclear strike on Russia. His press secretary, Sergei Nikiforov, explained the president's words.
The president spoke about the period until February 24th. Then it was necessary to apply preventive measures in order not to allow Russia to unleash a war.
Some French social media accounts have started spreading the manipulation. Such posts do not indicate that Zelensky's speech was on October the 6th. Many of them on both Facebook and Twitter are accompanied by identical text. Ukraine exports black soil abroad, together with remains of Red Army soldiers. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that Ukraine allegedly was and is engaged in selling the fertile layer of land abroad. He stated this during a meeting with representatives of the Young Army Military Youth Organization in honor of the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad. Putin came to this conclusion after the story, which was told by a meeting participant, about a German farmer who allegedly found in his garden a medal of a Red Army soldier killed in 1944 on the territory of Ukraine. The medal allegedly ended up in Germany as a result of the sale of Ukrainian soil.
I can't imagine that land is being sold with human remains. It's just unthinkable. But there is another circumstance that I immediately drew attention to while you were talking. After all, a German farmer came and handed over this medal to our consular representatives.
Russian newspaper media contacted Alexander Shot, who in 2021 handed over the find to the Russian Consulate General in Bonn. It turned out that the medal was not found by a German farmer, but by an employee of a waste processing company on a pile of rubbish. The stories about the alleged removal of Ukrainian black soil by the Nazis during the occupation period are nothing more than a Soviet historical myth about the Second World War. Their purpose was to show the German occupation regime as exclusively cruel.
So, Ruslan Deinichenko, the executive director of StopFake UA, our partners, is here to comment on the fakes produced by the Kremlin propaganda machine. So, hello and welcome.
Hello.
So, I've tried to investigate and try to comment on all the different fakes. And my first question is, how the Russian propaganda machine is choosing the topics. Because as we've seen in the previous review, they're talking about the fertile land, then they switch to nuclear threats and even to oppressing the Russian-speaking community. Where's the logic in all of that?
Yeah, the logic exists, and of course these are three different fakes, but they have something in common. And the common is the audience all these fakes are targeted. And this is foreign audience. And we know that this week President Zelensky is on a tour, visiting France, visiting Great Britain, visiting Brussels. And of course, Russian propaganda and disinformation in Kremlin, all day they want to create some circumstances and some information noise around this visit. And all these fakes, they are targeted, and the idea of these fakes is to remind the audience that the Zelensky so-called regime, they are Nazis, they support Nazis. They do not allow Ukrainians speak their native Russian language, and that minorities in Ukraine cannot speak Russian, minority cannot speak Russian language. And of course, the nuclear threats, it's again, every time that the Western countries, Western partners of Ukraine are going to provide us with a new bunch of weapons, modern weapons. The Kremlin and the Putin and Medvedev, they remind the Western countries that the Kremlin has an ability to use nuclear weapons. They threat Western countries with nuclear war. So the aim of all these three fakes is to spoil the intents, the tries of Ukrainian authorities to find new weapons that might be provided to Ukraine.
And the image of the president of Ukraine as well.
Of course, because some of these stories, they were repeated by Western medias, by European medias. You had some examples when French media, they had reports, false reports, that misleading reports about nuclear weapons and nuclear threats of Mr. Zelensky.
Are the fakes made by Russian propaganda machine and made by the Kremlin every single day can be successful among the community, among the European countries? Is there any success in what they're trying to do?
Russian propaganda machine is very creative, and every time they fail or they are not very successful, they try to invent new ways to reach people, new narratives to influence people in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union, the United States. So they are very creative, and they are trying to find new ways how to influence people. Of course, our project, the StopFake, and a lot of other people who fight Russian disinformation and propaganda, of course, we follow them and we try to track their activities and trying to find effective ways how to interfere and how we can stop spreading lies about Ukraine, and not just about Ukraine, but lies that Russian propaganda machine produces on an industrial scale.
Is there any mechanism, not just checking the fakes, but to make a punishment the Russian media for producing those fakes? Can we just go put them into jail or go to some jury? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's the ultimate goal of all fact-checkers and I think Ukrainian authorities is to punish those who produce disinformation, who intentionally disseminate lies, trying to fuel conflicts in Ukraine, in the European Union, in the United States. But so far, of course, our project, fact checkers in other countries, we collect the evidence. We have more than 50,000 pieces of evidence that we can provide to the international courts. And I hope the day will come when all these media personalities who are involved in these criminal activities will be in the court and will be punished, because it will be a very important lesson for future generations.
Why Russia is trying to dehumanize Ukrainians, talking about us like Nazis, talking about the nuclear threats, what they're trying to do, like not to make us real human beings or something?
Yeah, they're trying to persuade their own population that this war is justified, that Ukrainian are Nazis, so let's go and kill them. They want that a lot of people in Russia leave their jobs, leave their families, took machine guns to their hands and went to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians, because otherwise it would be very difficult to explain to Russians why they should kill Ukrainians, why they should support this war. So this is the only way how they can do it.
And by the way, Russian officials are trying to explain why they invaded Ukraine, and there is no logic explanation in what they are doing, because they are shifting the main aim of invading Ukraine all the time.
Yeah, that's true. And at the beginning, they were spreading information about biolab laboratories or nuclear weapons that Ukraine possesses. But later they started to create new causes for war, because of course it was absolutely well, it was bullshit. No one trusted that Ukraine invented mosquitoes that can bite only Russians, right? So they tried to invent new explanations why this war should be continued by Russia.
And my latest question for today. So who are those European people or the people from other countries who can accept all those fakes? Who are they? They're not trying to investigate. They're too lazy to do that. So what is the image of the person who can accept all those fakes?
There are different type of people who subscribe this point of view, who write such kind of stories on their Facebook, on Instagram accounts. Some of them are useful idiots who trust conspiracy theories and other bullshit. But some people, they do it for money. They do it because of political affiliation, because we suspect that Russia supports some political parties in the European Union, in European countries, far left, far right. Russia invests a lot of money to support them with media, to support them with cash, or to support their business in Russia. So there are different types of people who help Russia to promote this nonsense in European countries.
Thank you so much. Ruslan Deinichenko, the executive director of StopFake Ruslan, was the guest of Spotlight Ukraine, and we've just commented the Russian bullshit, and I'm not even sorry for what I've just said. This is Spotlight Ukraine, and we continue. A balloon has finally dashed hopes for improved relations between Washington and Beijing. The Chinese airship that was spotted in the American sky was probably spying on military installations. The President Biden ordered it to be shot down, and Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's visit to Beijing as well, which had been pinned on hopes of a diplomatic thaw between the two countries, was cancelled. The United States relation will have long-term consequences for the effort to stabilize relations with China, which are already close to a historic low, experts say.
It was this flying object that worsened Washington's relations with Beijing, which were already in crisis. According to experts, the Chinese balloon can collect intelligence and transmit information to Chinese satellites, and from there the data will be sent to the Chinese Army Command Center. However, Beijing claims that it was a civilian airship that was conducting meteorological research, but deviated from its route and accidentally flew over Latin America.
The Chinese side has explained the situation many times. What I want to emphasize is this incident was completely an accident due to uncontrollable external forces. The US Department of Defense has stated that this balloon or this airship did not pose a military or personal threat to any ground personnel. The US side, in spite of China's repeated statements, insisted on using force in an obvious overreaction, which China firmly opposes.
A US Department of Defense spokesman said that when a Chinese balloon was spotted near Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, home to one of the 3 US missile silos, the Pentagon immediately took action to prevent the collection of classified information. It was not disclosed what measures were taken. As a result, the Ministry of Defense decided to shoot down the balloon with a missile fired from an F-22.
Once it came over into the United States from Canada, I told the Defense Department wanted to shoot it down as soon as it was appropriate. They concluded we should not shoot it down over land. It was not a serious threat, and we should wait till it got across the water. We made it clear to China what we're going to do. They understand our position. We're not going to back off. We did the right thing, and there's not a question of weakening or strengthening. It's just reality.
The Pentagon itself has long used balloons in military operations. In the early 2000s, the Department of Defense launched tethered balloons over Iraq and Afghanistan, equipped with reconnaissance payloads. Last year, Politico reported that the Defense Department's 2023 budget included funding for balloon projects, which was even increased from $3.8 million in 2021 to $27 million last year.
Professor, political scientist and historian director of the SOAS China Institute, Professor Steve Tsang, is the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
So let's start with the so-called spy balloon over the territory of the United States. You probably know about this. So China declares that the balloon seriously deviated from just the planned course. But the Americans insist that the balloon was used by the Chinese military for spying. So whom to believe in this situation?
Well, if the Chinese government really send a balloon or allow a weather balloon to drift off course, the Chinese government could have afforded to tell the Americans or others that one of their balloons have gone astray, and therefore they can expect that they will drift into their airspace without creating a diplomatic incident. Or alternatively, they could have found a ways to lower the balloons so that the Americans can see that it is just a meteorological one. They did neither. So I think the American suspicion is much more likely to be correct than the Chinese government's explanation.
And by the way, the officials from the United States, they claim that China uses aerostats for spying purposes, not just over the United States, but all over the globe. So if that is correct, what is the true purpose of that? Maybe they just want to provoke Americans to start a military confrontation, especially knowing the serious situation between China and Taiwan these days.
Well, the Chinese government certainly would not have wanted the balloons to provoke a war with the United States. China does not want to have a war with the United States at this stage over Taiwan or any other issue. The simple reason is that China does not feel that it has the capacity to win in such a contest with the United States at the moment. They will wait until they are ready. But they may well, in fact, be sending out these balloons because they can and because they want to supplement the satellite images that they are already collecting. The Chinese are not the only ones who use aerial surveillance for intelligence purposes. The United States flies spy planes up and down the China coast on a regular basis and occasionally over Chinese airspace. And the Chinese government has wanted to return that favor to the Americans for quite a long time.
So you think it's just a regular spy routine between the biggest countries in the world?
Yes, I'm afraid that it is the mundane explanation that both sides realize the other is the single most important country that they will have to deal with. And therefore, they are spying on each other on a regular basis.
And now let's talk a bit about the third country, which is also one of the biggest in the world. If we talk about the resources, we talk about Russia. So the Japanese intelligence agency stated the message that China is probably supplying these days Russia with the military aid. So, and if we consider this situation, what is China for Ukraine? Friend or foe?
China's, or rather Xi Jinping's position to the Russian invasion of Ukraine from the beginning is one of declaring neutrality, supporting Putin, but paying no price. You being in Ukraine will know that Ukraine actually had good relationship with China before the invasion. Ukraine was a major supplier of feed grain to China and therefore a source of food security to China. So they don't really want you to be engaged in a war that will cause disruptions to the food production and supply. But Xi Jinping has a very strong personal relationship with Putin, and he decided to support Putin. What he has also decided is that this support, officially with no limits, in fact has very clear limits, which is that China will not do anything to support Russia if that will trigger secondary sanctions. So we have seen China not providing finished weapon systems to Russia, but spare parts and other technologies that can be used, which will not trigger secondary sanctions, will be supplied to the Russians.
Yes, thank you. So China is monitoring the reaction of the West during every single act in the Russia's war in Ukraine. And there is a serious threat of the new war in Asia. You've already said that China can start some military actions whenever the country is ready. So how serious is that? And is there gonna be the readiness in the upcoming 1 or 2 or 3 years?
Well, the Chinese government under Xi Jinping is committed to take Taiwan when China is ready and able to do so. But it would also like to do so at acceptable level of cost. And therefore, it is unlikely to want to provoke a war across the Taiwan Strait before China can demonstrate that it has overwhelming military superiority that will enable it to subdue Taiwan before the Americans can interfere militarily. The Chinese calculate that the Americans are likely to militarily interfere in the event of China using force against Taiwan. So they are indeed paying a lot of attention to the war in Ukraine, both in terms of how the weapon systems perform in Ukraine, as well as how the US and other Western countries react in their support to Ukraine. They will be seeing whether the same kind of support might be applied to Taiwan and how they can deal with it.
But at the same time, China doesn't want to trigger the United States or the Western countries for a new way or step of sanctions. Am I right?
Yes, that is absolutely correct. They don't want sanctions against China at the moment. And that's why there is a limit, I would say fairly clear limits, as to what China will do to help Russia, in spite of the declarations that the friendship and support is unlimited.
Thank you, Mr. Tsang. Professor Steve Tsang, the historian director of the SOAS China Institute, was the guest of Spotlight Ukraine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The president of Ukraine has made a tour of Europe. He visited London, Paris, and Brussels. In the United Kingdom, he addressed the parliament and asked powerful British tanks. Also, Mr. Zelensky had an audience with King Charles III. Amid the visit, London imposed new sanctions against Russian military enterprises and provided another military aid to Ukraine. In Paris, Zelensky met with French President Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor Scholz, who had traveled to Paris specifically for the occasion. Both leaders assured that their countries would support Ukraine as long as necessary. The issue of supplying Ukraine with modern aircraft was the #1 topic at the EU summit in Brussels. However, it will be possible to talk about concrete results only after the meeting of the Ramstein Contact Group on February the 14th.
The European Union has for the first time in its history supplied such large-scale and consistent military assistance, which we receive, and together with the according leadership by the member states, this security interaction with Ukraine has created a historical example for any aggressor. We have to guarantee security to all European countries. Thanks for your attention. Glory to Ukraine.
The Russian invasion caught him in Odessa at a Jewish wedding. On the terrible morning of February 24th, he says the entire wedding community was taking women and children to the border away from the war. After saying goodbye to his family, Rabbi Hillel Cohen began evacuating refugees and later volunteered to help the Ukrainian military with bulletproof vests and helmets. Now he's the only Jewish chaplain in the armed forces of Ukraine. And he knows better than anyone whether there are fascists in Ukraine, which Russian propaganda scares the world with.
Hillel Cohen gave this interview to an Israeli radio station in the first days of the full-scale invasion. His cry of the soul, he recalls, convinced millions of Israelis that a terrible war had indeed begun in Ukraine.
A week before the invasion, a friend from America wrote to me, "Run away, there will be a catastrophe, Biden warns." I sent a message to our communities that there is a person who is ready to pay for our tickets, but no one took it seriously. On February 24th, I was in Odessa at a Jewish wedding. In the morning, everyone woke up and drove women and children to the border in one caravan. I spent 2 weeks in duty-free, meeting buses, helping the elderly and children. I remember one woman had a heart attack. She got off, fell and died. It's impossible to forget that.
Later, the rabbi began to evacuate people from hot spots.
I had a friend by my side, Alexander Borisov, and we didn't sleep for 50 days and nights. Really, we just traveled all over Ukraine, bringing humanitarian aid and taking people out. Later, we started receiving requests from the mobilized to bring body armors, helmets, and we started bringing everything needed from Israel.
So Hillel Cohen began helping the Ukrainian military. Last fall, he became the only rabbi in the armed forces, where, according to him, about 1,000 Jews are currently serving.
This is a Torah that we have translated and dedicated to the whole of Ukraine, especially to the Jews serving in the armed forces. I go with it to visit the guys. Slava Ukraini! Героям слава! Thanks to Hillel for doing such an important work.
In addition to pastoral support, the rabbi of the armed forces believes that his other mission is to debunk the myths of Russian propaganda about Nazism in Ukraine.
Russia constantly accuses Ukraine of fascism and Nazism. When I stand on the street with the Torah, get on a train and do not hide the fact that I am Jewish, I see only respect from people. My 9 children were raised in Kiev and never had any problems. There are no fascists in Ukraine, and I consider it my task to speak about this to the whole world.
Kippas made by the rabbi are popular with Ukrainian military. Even ethnic Ukrainians wear them with the inscription "Jews defend Ukraine" to once again refute the myth of Nazism.
Mazel tov and Slava Ukraini. That was Spotlight Ukraine. Do not forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get all the latest information, the fake checks and the trends that consider the Ukrainian situation right now. See you next week. До побачення.